The 17th of January 1943, Schweinfurt, Germany, 11:47 hours. The winter sky hung pale and colourless over the industrial heart of Bavaria, a canvas stretched thin between earth and heaven. Beneath it, the ball-bearing factories hummed with the mechanical precision that kept the Wehrmacht's war machine turning. Inside the operations room of Jagdgeschwader 26, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler stood beside a radio operator, watching frost creep across the window in crystalline patterns. The air smelled of coal smoke and engine oil. Outside, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds sat on frozen tarmac, their yellow noses pointed toward the west like accusing fingers. Then the sirens began. Not the familiar wail of a single alarm, but a chorus layer upon layer of mechanical screaming that meant only one thing. A formation so large the spotters couldn't count the individual aircraft. Stigler pulled on his leather gloves, each finger deliberate, and walked toward his fighter. The ground crew was already spinning the propeller. He could see his breath in the cockpit, small clouds of mortality in the freezing air. As he climbed to altitude, breaking through the overcast at 4,000 meters, he saw them. They came like a migration of steel birds, impossibly many, their contrails weaving a fabric of white across the blue. B-17 flying fortresses. Dozens of them, perhaps 100. The sun caught their aluminum skin and transformed them into something almost divine, mechanical angels, delivering not salvation, but fire. Stigler had intercepted American bombers before. He knew their formations, their defensive tactics, the way their gunners tracked you with those terrible 50-caliber machine guns. But something about this formation was different. They flew tighter, more confident, as if they knew something the Luftwaffe did not. He armed his guns and dove toward the bomber stream. In the months before January 1943, the Luftwaffe had grown accustomed to a certain arithmetic of aerial combat. The mathematics were brutal but predictable. A bomber, no matter how many guns it carried, was still fundamentally a transport aircraft forced into combat. Its structure was a compromise. Thin aluminum skin stretched over frameworks designed for lift and cargo capacity, not survival. When 20mm cannon shells struck a bomber's fuselage, they passed through like knives through paper. When they struck a fuel tank, the aircraft became a funeral pyre at 20,000 feet. When they struck a crew compartment, men died in fractions of seconds, their bodies torn apart by fragmentation and explosive force. The Luftwaffe pilots had learned to exploit these vulnerabilities with scientific precision. Approach from the front, where the bomber's defensive fire was weakest. Aim for the cockpit, the engines, the wing routes where fuel and structure met. A 3-second burst from a well-aimed attack run could cripple a bomber, send it spiraling earthward trailing smoke and flame, its crew either dead or dying, or desperately seeking parachutes that might not deploy in time. The British Lancasters and Halifaxes that had come by night were dangerous, numerous, but ultimately fragile. Their losses mounted into the thousands. By late 1942, RAF Bomber Command was losing aircraft faster than factories could replace them, crews faster than training schools could graduate them. The Americans, arriving in Britain throughout 1942 with their doctrine of daylight precision bombing, had seemed almost naive. Their bombers flew in daylight, where German fighters could see them clearly, track them easily, attack them repeatedly. The Luftwaffe staff officers had read the intelligence reports about the B-17 with something approaching satisfaction. Yes, it carried more guns than any bomber they had encountered, 13 50-caliber machine guns in the latest models, covering nearly every approach angle. Yes, it flew in tight defensive formations called combat boxes, designed to create overlapping fields of fire. But guns alone could not protect an aircraft whose fundamental structure remained as vulnerable as any other bomber. The early raids seemed to confirm this analysis. When American bombers struck targets in France and the Low Countries in late 1942, German fighters shot them down in respectable numbers. Not the catastrophic losses that would force the Americans to abandon daylight bombing entirely, but enough to prove the point. Bombers, even heavily armed American bombers, could be destroyed. The kill reports came back marked with familiar details: fuselages that disintegrated under cannon fire, wings that folded when fuel tanks exploded, cockpits that shattered like glass. Then came the deep penetration raids into Germany itself, and the mathematics began to change. Franz Stigler's first attack run that January morning followed doctrine precisely. He approached from 11 o'clock high, positioning his Bf-109 so the bomber's dorsal turret couldn't track him effectively, diving at 350 km per hour with the sun behind him. His target was a B-17 flying in the middle of the formation, its olive, drab and neutral grey camouflage scheme stark against the winter sky. Through his Revy gun sight, he could see the aircraft's details growing larger, the ball turret beneath the fuselage rotating to track him, the waist gunners, visible as dark shapes behind their open windows, the tail gunner in his isolated position swinging his twin 50s in a slow arc. He pressed the firing button. The Bf-109 shuddered as its weapons fired in sequence. Two 7.92mm machine guns in the cowling, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, and a single 20mm MG-151 cannon firing through the propeller hub. The tracer rounds drew a line through space, a geometry of death connecting his aircraft to the bomber. He watched them strike, and the bomber kept flying. Stigler pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing him into his seat, and banked away before the formation's combined defensive fire could find him. He climbed back to altitude, breathing hard, checking his fuel and ammunition. The attack had been textbook perfect. He had scored hits, he was certain of it. He had seen the tracer impacts walking across the bomber's fuselage from nose to tail, but there had been no explosion, no fire, no visible damage at all. The bomber maintained formation, its engine steady, its flight path unwavering. He made a second pass, this time from the front quarter where doctrine said the bombers were most vulnerable. Again his guns hammered. Again the tracers found their target, sparking against aluminum skin. Again nothing. The bomber flew on as if his attacks were mere inconveniences, raindrops against a steel roof. On his third attack, aiming more carefully, rationing his remaining ammunition, he saw something that made him doubt his own perceptions. His 20mm cannon shells struck the bomber's wing root, the junction where wing met fuselage, where fuel tanks and structural spars created a target that should have been catastrophic. He saw the shells impact. He saw the flash of explosive detonation, and then he saw the bomber waggle its wings slightly, adjusting its position in the formation, and continue toward its target. Stigler broke off the attack, his ammunition exhausted, and turned back toward base. As he flew south, he passed other Luftwaffe fighters climbing to intercept the bomber stream Bf-109 seconds, Bf-190 seconds, even some of the older Bf-110 twin-engine fighters. He watched them attack. He watched their cannon fire strike home. And he watched the American bombers absorb the damage and continue flying, as if they were not aircraft at all, but some new form of mechanical creature that refused to die. The debriefing room at Schweinfurt Air Base smelled of coffee substitute and cigarette smoke. 23 pilots crowded around a long wooden table, their faces marked with exhaustion and confusion. The operations officer, a Hauptmann with a Knight's Cross at his throat, stood at the front with a pointer and a map of the bomber route. He listened to their reports with an expression that evolved from professional skepticism to genuine concern. Oberleutnant Dieter Meyer described emptying his entire ammunition load into a single B, 17 400 rounds of machine gun fire and 60 rounds of cannon shells, only to watch it maintain formation. Lieutenant Hans Berger reported scoring direct hits on a bomber's cockpit with 20mm high-explosive rounds that should have killed both pilots instantly. Instead, the bomber had turned slightly, closing the gap in the formation his attack had created. Feldwebel Klaus Weber, a veteran with 37 confirmed kills, described something even more inexplicable. Watching his cannon shells penetrate a bomber's fuselage and exit the other side, leaving neat holes that seemed to cause no damage whatsoever, as if the aircraft's interior was somehow protected against fragmentation and explosive force. "They are armoured," someone said. "Like tanks," the operations officer frowned. "Bombers cannot be armoured. The weight penalty would be prohibitive. They could not carry bombs, could not reach altitude, could not—" "Then explain this," Stigler interrupted, his voice carrying a sharp edge. He placed a spent 20mm shell casing on the table, rolling it so the dim light caught its brass surface. I put a dozen of these into a single aircraft. Direct hits, center mass, wing roots, engine nacelles. That bomber should be scattered across Bavaria in 10,000 pieces. Instead, it dropped its bombs on the factory and turned west toward England. The room fell silent. Outside, they could hear the sounds of aircraft being rearmed, engines being tested, ground crews preparing for the next scramble. The Hauptmann looked at the shell casing, then at the faces around the table. These were not inexperienced pilots making exaggerated claims. These were professionals, men who had fought over the Channel and the Eastern Front, who had shot down Spitfires and Hurricanes and Yaks and Airacobras. If they said something was wrong, something was wrong. "I will forward your reports to headquarters," he said finally. "Perhaps intelligence has information we lack." But even as he spoke, all of them knew the truth. They were encountering something new, something the textbooks and tactical manuals had not prepared them for. The Americans had changed the fundamental equation of bomber combat, and the Luftwaffe did not yet understand how. To comprehend what the German pilots were experiencing, one must first understand what they had expected. The bombers of 1939 through 1942 followed a design philosophy born from the assumption that no aircraft could survive sustained fighter attack. The best hope was speed, altitude, and defensive armament make yourself difficult to catch, difficult to hit, and deadly to approach. But the airframe itself remained inherently vulnerable. Aluminum skin 3 mm thick might keep out wind and weather, but it offered no protection against bullets, no defense against cannon shells. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, in its earliest variants, had followed this same philosophy. The B-17C and B-17D models that had flown in 1940 and 1941 were fast, well-armed, and fundamentally fragile. When Japanese fighters caught a formation of B-17 seconds over the Philippines in December of 1941, they shot them down with almost contemptuous ease. The American crews died trapped in aluminum coffins that crumpled under machine gun fire. The after-action reports, typed on onion-skin paper and filed in manila folders, documented a massacre. But American industrial philosophy contained a strand of thought alien to European military tradition. If a problem could not be solved through tactics or training, solve it through engineering. If engineering could not eliminate a problem, overwhelm it with resources. The B-17's designers at Boeing, along with engineers from the Army Air Force's Materiel Command, began a systematic program to transform the bomber from a vulnerable transport into something approaching an armored fighting vehicle. They started with the crew positions. In early B-17 models, pilots sat behind windscreens of ordinary aircraft glass. Bombardiers lay in unprotected nose compartments. Gunners stood in positions open to the slipstream and enemy fire. When the B-17E entered service in late 1941, it carried something unprecedented: armor plate. Not the token armor that fighter pilots sat on a single steel plate beneath the seat, but comprehensive protection. The pilots received armor plate behind their seats, armor plate at their sides, and armored glass windscreens composed of laminated glass and bullet-resistant polycarbonate capable of stopping 20 mm cannon rounds. The total weight, 93 kilograms. The bombardier in the nose received an armored seat and armored glass panels for the nose compartment. The top turret gunner sat inside an armored housing. The ball turret gunner, suspended beneath the fuselage in a rotating sphere of aluminum and plexiglass, received armor plate protecting the mechanism. Even the tail gunner, isolated at the aircraft's rear, sat behind armor plate and armored glass. But this was only the beginning. The Luftwaffe intelligence officers who interrogated captured B-17 crews in early 1943 could not comprehend what the Americans described. The prisoners spoke of armor everywhere, not just around crew positions, but protecting critical systems. Armor around the oxygen bottles that kept crews alive at high altitude, armor around the hydraulic lines that controlled flaps and landing gear, armor around the electrical junction boxes that powered turrets and bomb release mechanisms. Armor around the oil tanks, around the engine mounts, around the ammunition storage boxes. One intelligence report, filed in February 1943 and later captured by Allied forces advancing through Germany, contains a passage marked with exclamation points in the margin. The enemy pilot claims his aircraft carries more than 400 kilograms of armor plate, distributed throughout the fuselage. This appears to be gross exaggeration or deliberate misinformation. No bomber could carry such weight and still perform its mission. Nevertheless, combat reports continue to describe hits that should be catastrophic but produce minimal effect. The German analysts were both right and wrong. The later B-17G models carried not 400 but nearly 500 kilograms of armor, half a metric ton of hardened steel plate, in thicknesses ranging from 6 millimeters to 40 millimeters, depending on the component being protected. By comparison, the British Lancaster carried approximately 60 kilograms of armor. The German He-111 bomber carried less than 30, but weight alone explained nothing. The Americans had not simply bolted armor plates onto a standard bomber airframe. They had redesigned the aircraft's structure to accommodate protection as an integral component. The armor was not an addition but a transformation. They had calculated angles of attack, identified the most likely trajectories of enemy fire, and positioned armor plates not just to stop projectiles, but to deflect them. A cannon shell striking a B-17's nose armor at an oblique angle would skip away like a stone on water, its energy dispersed, its explosive force wasted against steel, rather than penetrating to flesh and systems. They had done something else as well, something that revealed a distinctly American approach to warfare. They had made the armor modular, standardized, mass-producible. Each B-17 rolling off the production lines in Seattle, Long Beach, and Burbank received identical armor installation. There was no hand-fitting, no custom fabrication, no artisanal metalwork, just steel plates with pre-drilled holes and standard bolts, installed by workers following illustrated instructions, repeated thousands of times across thousands of aircraft. The Luftwaffe had no equivalent. Their bombers remained fundamentally unarmored because German industrial capacity could not support such extravagance. Steel was rationed, prioritized for tanks and U-boats and artillery. The idea of putting half a ton of armor into every bomber was not merely impractical, it was inconceivable. Hauptmann Josef Sepp Wurmheller, commanding officer of Jagdgruppe 2, encountered the new reality on a frozen February morning near the Dutch coast. He was an ace with 93 confirmed kills, a holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, a pilot whose skill was documented in Luftwaffe training films shown to new fighter pilots. He had shot down Spitfires over Britain, Hurricanes over France, Sturmovix over Russia. He knew how aircraft died. His Furv 190 intercepted a damaged B-17 struggling to keep up with its formation. One engine feathered, trailing thin smoke. This should have been an easy kill, a wounded bomber, separated from the protective fire of the formation, limping home. Wurmheller positioned himself carefully, approaching from the bomber's blind spot beneath and behind. He triggered his weapons, 4 20mm MG 151 cannons, 2 in the wing roots and 2 in the outer wings, capable of firing 1,300 rounds per minute combined. The bomber's belly turret exploded. Wurmheller saw it clearly, the ball turret mechanism disintegrating under the impact of cannon shells, shards of plexiglass and aluminum spinning away into the slipstream. He had killed the belly gunner. The bomber was now defenseless from below. He made a second pass, taking his time, putting a 3-second burst into the fuselage just behind the wing. This should have detonated ammunition, set fuel tanks ablaze, killed the waist gunners, severed the hydraulic lines, shattered the structural spars. The bomber shuddered. A panel flew away from the fuselage, and then the aircraft steadied, its remaining 3 engines pulling it forward, maintaining altitude, continuing west. Wurmheller made 5 more attack runs, expending his entire ammunition supply. He put nearly 200 rounds of 20mm cannon fire into that single bomber. He saw his rounds strike home. He saw the flashes of explosive detonation. He saw debris streaming from the fuselage. The bomber reached the English coast and disappeared into low clouds. In his debriefing, Wormheller sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "I hit him everywhere," he said finally. "Everywhere. He should be dead 10 times over, but he kept flying. The armor—" He paused, searching for words. "It is not just plates. It is a system. They have armored everything. The fuel tanks are self-sealing. The hydraulics are redundant. The control cables are duplicated. You can hit them, and hit them, and hit them, and they absorb it, like they are not made of aluminum at all, but stone." The intelligence officer taking notes looked up. "Stone can be broken." "Yes," Wormheller agreed. "But how much ammunition do we have to break it? And how long before we run out?" The answer to Wormheller's question lay in factories he would never see, in a continent he would never visit, in an industrial capacity so vast that German economists had classified American production figures as propaganda because they seemed mathematically impossible. By early 1943, American factories were producing B-17 bombers at a rate of 14 per day, 14 complete aircraft, each weighing 30,000 kilograms empty, each requiring 65,000 individual parts, each containing 500 kilograms of armor plate. Every day, 7,000 kilograms of armor steel was being installed in B-17 seconds alone, not counting B-24 Liberators, not counting the fighters that escorted them, not counting the armor going into tanks and personnel carriers and ships. The United States Steel Corporation had built entirely new mills, just to produce armor plate for aircraft. Workers operated rolling machines 24 hours a day, pressing steel into precise thicknesses, cutting it into predetermined shapes, punching holes for standard bolts. The scale overwhelmed German intelligence analysis. One report from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, dated March 1943, reads, "If American production claims are accurate, they are manufacturing more armor for bombers each month than we produce for all combat vehicles combined." This suggests either gross exaggeration or an industrial capacity against which we cannot compete indefinitely. The report's conclusion was carefully neutral, professionally cautious, but its implications were stark. The Luftwaffe was fighting an opponent who could afford to armor aircraft so heavily they became difficult to destroy, while German bombers remained vulnerable because armor meant weight, and weight meant reduced bomb loads, and reduced range and reduced performance. The Americans were not smarter or more skilled. They were simply richer, so materially wealthy that they could afford solutions German engineers could only imagine. And they were sharing that wealth in ways that had psychological impact far beyond mere statistics. Unteroffizier Hermann Buchner, a tail gunner on a Ju-88 medium bomber, saw his first B-17 close-up in circumstances that would haunt him for the remainder of the war. His aircraft, damaged by anti-aircraft fire over the Netherlands, had crash-landed in a field near the English Channel. The crew survived, walking away from the wreckage with minor injuries, a miracle in itself. They began the long walk toward friendly lines, knowing British Home Guard units were searching for them. Instead, they encountered an American bomber crew. The B-17 had been hit by flak, had lost 2 engines, and had been forced down in the same region. When Buchner and his crew approached the crash site, they expected to find American aviators in similar condition to themselves, bruised, exhausted, grateful to be alive. What they found instead seemed like a scene from a propaganda film, except it was real. The American crew had inflated life rafts from the bomber's emergency equipment and were sitting on them like furniture. They had spread parachutes as blankets. They were eating, not survival rations, not the sawdust-tasting emergency biscuits German aircrew carried, but actual food. Chocolate bars, canned meat, crackers, cigarettes, chewing gum. One American was opening a can of peaches with a folding knife. Another was heating coffee using a small chemical heater that produced flame without smoke. Buchner's crew approached slowly, hands visible, calling out in broken English. The Americans looked up, startled but not panicked. For a moment, the two groups stared at each other. Enemy aircrew, brought down in the same battle, meeting on neutral ground before either army could arrive. One of the Americans stood. He was a large man, with captain's bars on his leather jacket. He looked at the Germans, looked at their condition, the torn uniforms, the oil-stained faces, the visible hunger in their eyes, and made a decision. He walked over, carrying a cardboard box. "You guys hungry?" he asked in simple English, gesturing to make his meaning clear. He gave them chocolate. Hershey bars, still wrapped in brown paper and foil. He gave them cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, in a green pack. He gave them 2 cans of Spam, showing them how the key worked to peel back the metal. He gave them a canteen of water, fresh and clean, without the chemical taste of purification tablets. Buchner took the chocolate, held it in his palm like something precious and impossible. It had been nearly a year since he had tasted real chocolate. Sugar was rationed in Germany. Civilians received 125 grams per week when available. Military rations included occasional substitutes made from roasted acorns. This American was giving away chocolate as if it were common, as if it had no value. "Why?" Buchner asked in German, not expecting the American to understand. The captain shrugged. "You're out of the war now, same as us." He gestured at both crash sites. "May as well wait for pickup on a full stomach." British Home Guard arrived 30 minutes later, farmers with rifles and an old truck. They took both crews into custody, polite but firm, and drove them to separate facilities. Buchner spent the rest of the war in a POW camp in Yorkshire, but he never forgot that moment in the field. Not the chocolate, though the taste stayed with him for years. Not the cigarettes, though the smell of Lucky Strikes would always bring him back to that day. What he remembered was the casual abundance, the way the American had given away food as if there would always be more, as if scarcity was not even a concept he needed to consider. Years later, Buchner would write in his memoir, "We were fighting men who could armor their aircraft like battleships and still carry chocolate for every crew. What chance did we ever have?" The armor protection extended beyond passive steel plates. American engineers had developed self-sealing fuel tanks, a technology that seemed almost like magic to Luftwaffe pilots who watched their incendiary rounds strike B-17 wing tanks and fail to ignite explosions. The technology was simple in concept, diabolically clever in execution. Each fuel tank was surrounded by layers of rubber and chemical compounds that swelled when exposed to gasoline. When a bullet or shell fragment punctured the tank, fuel leaked out, but the rubber layers absorbed the gasoline and expanded, sealing the hole within seconds. The tank could sustain multiple hits, lose fuel capacity, but rarely rupture catastrophically. British bombers had similar systems, but American versions were more robust, more reliable, more extensively implemented. A German technical intelligence report from April 1943, based on examination of crashed B-17 seconds, describes the system with reluctant admiration. The fuel tank construction represents a significant advance in survivability design. The enemy has accepted a weight penalty of approximately 15% in order to reduce catastrophic fire risk by an estimated 70–80%. Our own attempts to develop similar systems have been hindered by rubber shortages and the weight requirements conflicting with performance specifications. The Americans appear to prioritize crew survival over performance optimization. That final sentence contained a truth the author perhaps did not fully grasp. The Americans could afford to prioritize crew survival over performance because they had such overwhelming industrial capacity that performance margins were less critical. A B-17 could fly slower, climb less efficiently, carry a reduced bomb load, and still accomplish its mission because there were so many of them. The Luftwaffe, fighting with finite resources, could not make such trade-offs. Each aircraft had to achieve maximum performance because there were never enough aircraft. By mid-1943, Luftwaffe tactics began to evolve in response to the armor reality. If cannon shells striking the fuselage caused minimal damage, then aim for components that could not be armored without destroying flight performance. The engine nacelles, the wings' outer sections, the tail control surfaces. If frontal attacks were ineffective against armored cockpits, attack from the rear where tail gunners' field of fire was limited. If single fighters could not inflict sufficient damage before defensive fire drove them off, then attack in pairs or groups, concentrating fire. These adaptations increased B-17 losses, but never to the level that would force the Americans to abandon daylight bombing. The fundamental equation had changed. In 1939, a bomber needed luck to survive fighter attack. By 1943, a B-17 needed bad luck to be shot down multiple hits in critical areas, sustained attack from multiple fighters, damage accumulating beyond the armor's capacity to protect. The Luftwaffe's kill ratio against B-17 seconds remained lower than against any other bomber type they encountered. Intelligence officers compiled statistics that were forwarded up through command channels to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself. On average, shooting down a B-17 required 3 times as much ammunition and twice as many attack runs as shooting down a Lancaster or Halifax. Luftwaffe fighter pilots expended an average of 150 rounds of 20mm ammunition per B-17 kill, compared to 50 rounds per Lancaster kill. The implications rippled through German logistics. Ammunition factories were already struggling to meet demand from all fronts. The Eastern Front alone consumed millions of rounds monthly. Now fighter pilots over Germany were burning through cannon ammunition at unsustainable rates while achieving declining kill ratios. Some Luftwaffe units began rationing ammunition, instructing pilots to break off attacks after expending a predetermined amount regardless of whether they had achieved a kill. This was psychological defeat wearing the mask of practical necessity. German pilots knew they were being asked to fight with one hand tied behind their backs, not because their commanders were incompetent, but because the enemy's material wealth was so overwhelming that simple attrition became impossible to sustain. Oberst Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful fighter aces and a strategic thinker respected even by his enemies, understood the deeper implications. In a conference at Luftwaffe High Command in June 1943, he presented an analysis that went beyond tactical concerns. The American bomber offensive is not merely a military operation, it is an industrial demonstration. Every B-17 that reaches its target proves American productive capacity. Every B-17 that survives our attacks and returns to England proves American engineering superiority. But more significantly, every B-17 that absorbs 50 or 100 cannon shells and still flies proves that America can afford to build aircraft with such margins of survivability that our traditional methods of air combat become economically unsustainable. Galland paused, looking around the conference room at faces that ranged from skeptical to hostile. He continued, "We have fighter pilots reporting direct hits that cause no critical damage. We have gun camera footage showing our weapons striking vital areas with no visible effect. The Americans have changed the fundamental nature of bomber combat. They have not made their aircraft invulnerable, they have made them expensive to destroy. And because they possess industrial resources vastly exceeding our own, they can afford this expense. We cannot." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. No one wanted to articulate the conclusion Galland was approaching, that Germany was fighting an opponent whose material advantages were so profound that tactical skill and strategic brilliance could only delay, not prevent, eventual defeat. Göring, who chaired the conference, dismissed Galland's concerns with a wave. "Then we build better fighters, with heavier weapons, and we train pilots more intensively. The solution is effort, not despair." But the pilots flying combat missions over Germany understood what their commanders seemed unwilling to acknowledge. Effort required resources, and resources were finite. The Americans had resources that seemed infinite, or close enough that the difference didn't matter. The psychological impact of the armor extended beyond combat itself. Luftwaffe pilots who successfully shot down B-17 seconds often found the victory Pyrrhic they had expended their entire ammunition load, burned most of their fuel, and risked their lives multiple times to destroy a single aircraft that would be replaced within days by another rolling off an American assembly line. The ratio was unsustainable. For every B-17 shot down, Boeing built 3 more. For every Luftwaffe pilot who survived a combat sortie, training capacity produced 0.7 replacements fewer than 1-for-1, and diminishing as the war continued. Unteroffiziant Kurt Bühligen, a fighter pilot with over 112 kills to his credit, described the feeling in a letter to his brother in August 1000, 943. I shot down 2 B-17 seconds yesterday. Both required multiple attack runs, both absorbed cannon fire that should have torn them apart. When the first one finally went down, trailing fire from 3 engines, I felt no satisfaction, only exhaustion, because I know tomorrow there will be more, and the next day more still, and the day after that. We are trying to empty the ocean with buckets, while the Americans are building a pipeline from the Atlantic itself. The letter was intercepted by military censors, who flagged it for defeatist sentiment. Boulagan received a written reprimand, but the censors did not share his observations with higher command, perhaps because they recognized the truth in his words and preferred not to document it officially. American bomber crews, meanwhile, came to trust their aircraft's protection with a faith that bordered on superstition. The armor became a physical manifestation of American industrial might, a tangible reminder that they flew aircraft built by a nation wealthy enough to prioritize their survival. Technical Sergeant Robert Morgan, a ball turret gunner on a B-17 named Memphis Belle, wrote in his diary after a mission over Bremen, "Flak hit us 78 times today. I counted the holes when we landed. 78 pieces of German steel went through our airplane, but the armor stopped most of them from getting to anything important. One piece hit the armor plate right behind my head. I heard it clang like a church bell. That plate is only an inch thick, but it's the difference between me writing this and my family getting a telegram." The armor plates became good luck charms. Crews named them, touched them before missions, told stories about the rounds they had stopped. Ground crews painted small symbols on the armor plates, one mark for each hit that had been stopped. Some aircraft accumulated dozens of marks, their armor scarred and dented but still functional, still protecting. This was psychological warfare in reverse. Where the Germans experienced frustration and depletion, Americans experienced confidence and validation. Both responses were rational reactions to the same material reality. American aircraft were built with such comprehensive protection that crew survival rates increased dramatically compared to unarmored bombers. The statistics were documented in Army Air Force's operational research. Crews flying armored B-17 seconds had a 40% higher chance of surviving to complete their 25 mission tour, compared to crews flying earlier, less protected models. The armor's symbolic significance extended beyond the aircrew. War correspondents visiting bomber bases in England inevitably featured the armor in their articles. Ernie Pyle, the most famous American war correspondent, wrote in November 1943, "I stood beside a B-17 that had just returned from a mission over Germany. The ground crew was counting holes. They had reached 250 and were still finding more. Cannon shells, machine gun rounds, flak fragments. But the crew walked away without serious injury. The pilot showed me the armor plate behind his seat. It was dented, scored, chipped but intact. He put his hand on it like a man might touch a religious icon. 'This steel,' he said, 'weighs more than my wife, and I love it just as much.'" Pyle's article was published in 300 newspapers across America. It was read in factories where workers assembled B-17 seconds, in steel mills where armor plate was rolled, in small towns where families waited for letters from sons flying combat missions over Europe. The armor became a symbol not just of protection, but of American industrial morality, the idea that a wealthy nation had an obligation to spend its wealth protecting its warriors. This stood in stark contrast to both German and Soviet approaches. German industry prioritized performance and quantity over protection. Soviet industry prioritized quantity over everything else. Both approaches were rational given resource constraints. But the American approach said something different. We are rich enough that we don't have to choose between protection and performance. We can have both. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe had developed new weapons specifically designed to overcome B-17 armor. The R-4M rocket, the 30mm Mk-108 cannon-firing explosive shells weighing 330 grams each, even air-to-air bombing attempts using modified anti-tank weapons. Some of these weapons were effective. The Mk-108, when it struck a B-17, could inflict catastrophic damage, regardless of armor. But the weapons came too late, and in too small quantities. The fundamental problem remained. Germany was trying to develop technical solutions to compensate for industrial inadequacy. America was applying industrial overwhelming force to eliminate technical challenges. One approach required innovation, precision, and perfect execution. The other required factories, steel, and workers, all things America possessed in effectively unlimited quantity. Lieutenant Walter Krupinski, flying an FW-190 equipped with the experimental 30mm cannons, shot down 3 B-17 seconds in a single mission in January 1944. His after-action report noted, "The Mk-108 is devastatingly effective. 2 or 3 hits will destroy a bomber regardless of armor. But the weapon carries only 60 rounds and fires slowly. I expended 45 rounds destroying 3 bombers. The Americans sent 120 bombers on this mission. We would need 40 fighters with this weapon to stop the raid. We had 6. The mathematics of attrition had become impossible to ignore. The Luftwaffe could develop wonder weapons, deploy ace pilots, execute perfect tactics and still lose, because the Americans could accept a 5% loss rate sustained indefinitely, while German loss rates, even if lower, could not be replaced by training and production capacity. The armor's impact on German morale extended beyond the pilots to the civilian population watching the war from below. German citizens, standing in rubble after bombing raids, looking up at the contrails of formations that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon, understood that they were facing an enemy whose aircraft could not be stopped by conventional means. The psychological effect was corrosive. A Sicherheitsdienst (SD) internal report from November 1943, documenting public morale in Hamburg after the devastating firestorm raids, includes this observation. Citizens report seeing German fighters attacking the bomber formations. They report seeing shells strike the enemy aircraft. Yet the bombers continue, drop their loads, and turn for home. This creates a perception that our defenses are ineffective, that the enemy possesses technological superiority we cannot match. The fact that some bombers are shot down does not compensate for the psychological impact of seeing the majority survive despite visible battle damage. The report's author recommended increased propaganda, emphasizing German fighter pilot heroism and de-emphasizing the enemy's material advantages. But propaganda could not change the material reality that German civilians witnessed with their own eyes. American bombers flying through flak and fighter attacks as if protected by divine providence rather than mere armor plate. American interrogators interviewing captured German pilots in 1944 and 1945 found recurring themes. The prisoners expressed professional respect for B-17 engineering. They described the armor system with a mixture of frustration and admiration. But underlying these tactical observations was a deeper recognition. They had fought against an industrial capacity so vast that individual courage and skill were rendered almost irrelevant. One interrogation transcript, declassified in 1973, contains this exchange. Interrogator: Did you believe Germany could win the air war over the Reich? Prisoner Ober: Heinrich Bartels, 99 kills. In 1942. Yes. We believed skilled pilots in superior aircraft could defeat superior numbers. By 1943, we understood the Americans were not just numerous, they were protected. Their bombers absorbed damage that should have destroyed them. Interrogator: What would have made the difference? Prisoner: If Germany had America's factories, if we could armor our bombers, replace our losses, produce ammunition without limit. But those are fantasies. We fought with what we had. It was never going to be enough. The final evolution of B-17 armor came in early 1945, with field modifications that added even more protection to vulnerable areas identified through combat experience. Some bomber groups installed additional armor around the radio operator's position, around the auxiliary power units, even around the oxygen system regulators. These modifications were not officially authorized by Army Air Force's technical orders. They were improvised by ground crews who understood that every kilogram of additional armor increased crew survival rates. By war's end, Some B-17 seconds carried 600 kilograms of armor more than many light tanks. They flew slower because of the weight, climbed less efficiently, consumed more fuel, but they brought their crews home. In the final accounting, that was what mattered. The last months of the war saw Luftwaffe resistance decline precipitously, not because German pilots lost skill or courage, but because they ran out of aircraft, fuel, and ammunition. The material advantage that American armor represented was merely one aspect of a comprehensive industrial superiority that made German defeat inevitable once American productive capacity was fully mobilized. But for the pilots who fought in 1943 and 1944, the armor was not a mere statistic or footnote. It was the physical embodiment of the gap between American and German industrial capacity. Every cannon shell that bounced off armor plate, every attack run that failed to achieve a kill, every bomber that made it home, despite catastrophic damage, each was a small lesson in the futility of fighting an opponent whose wealth could be transformed into protection. Epilogue. After the war, several B-17 seconds were preserved as monuments and museum pieces. Visitors can walk through them, touch the aluminum skin, sit in the crew positions. Some of these aircraft still carry their armor plate. You can see the dents, the scars, the marks of combat. You can put your hand on the steel and feel its weight, its substance. But what you cannot feel, cannot truly comprehend without having been there, is what that armor meant, not just as protection, but as promise. A promise that the richest nation on earth would spend its wealth, its steel, its labor, its industrial might to bring its warriors home. A promise that quantity could be transformed into quality, that material abundance could be forged into survival. The German pilots who faced those armored bombers understood this promise, even if their own nation could not match it. They fought with skill and courage against an opponent whose advantages were not primarily of technology or tactics, but of sheer, overwhelming material capacity. In another century, strategists would call this overmatch, the condition where one side's resources are so superior that tactical excellence cannot compensate. But in the winter skies over Germany, it was simpler and more immediate. They were shooting at aircraft that refused to die, because the nation that built them could afford to make them nearly immortal. Franz Stigler survived the war. In the decades after, he would sometimes speak at aviation museums, answering questions from audiences who wanted to understand what it was like to fight the air war over the Reich. Someone always asked about the B-17, about its reputation, about whether it was really as tough as the legends claimed. Stigler would pause before answering. He would remember that January morning, his ammunition exhausted, his attacks ineffective, watching the bomber formation continue toward its target, as if his presence were merely an inconvenience. He would remember the debriefing, the confusion, the slow realization that the rules of combat had changed. The B-17, he would say finally, was not just an airplane, it was a message. It said, "We can afford to protect our men with half a ton of steel, and we will, because we have so much steel that this is not even a sacrifice." That message, more than the bombs, more than the fighters, more than the tanks, that message is what defeated us. You cannot fight a message with bullets. You can only acknowledge its truth. And in acknowledging that truth, he was recognizing what the armor had always represented. Not invulnerability, but value. The value American society placed on individual lives, manifested in steel and rivets and 500 kilograms of armor plate. In a war where millions died and entire cities were reduced to ash, this value, this stubborn insistence that wealth should protect rather than merely destroy, was itself a kind of victory. The armor plates are silent now. Museum pieces, historical artifacts, but they still carry their message, dented and scarred, for anyone willing to listen. That abundance, when forged with purpose, becomes its own form of strength. And that strength, in the end, proved more powerful than skill or courage or desperation. It proved more powerful than anything the Luftwaffe could throw against it.